He needed a wife who looked stable on paper, my sister-in-law said quietly, sliding a folded piece of paper across the funeral reception table toward me. That's all you ever were to him. I'm sorry someone finally has to tell you. I stood in a stranger's living room, dressed in black, holding a plate of food I couldn't eat, staring at a document with my husband's signature on it, dated 4 months before our wedding. Everyone around me was grieving a woman I'd been told, for 3 years, had abandoned her daughter completely and wanted nothing to do with either of them. That woman had never abandoned anyone. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, hit the like button now. If you've ever stayed silent while someone underestimated you, comment here, below. And subscribe to Story Retribution because today's ending proves that karma always arrives, just not when people expect it. I met my husband Grant 4 years ago through a mutual friend, quickly falling for his warmth, his steadiness, and his devoted love for his 6-year-old daughter Maya from a previous relationship. Grant explained early on that Maya's biological mother, a woman named Renee, had struggled significantly with substance abuse issues and had essentially disappeared from Maya's life when she was 3 years old, leaving Grant to raise their daughter entirely alone. I fell in love with both of them, Grant and Maya, and when Grant proposed after a 1.5 years of dating, I said yes without hesitation, excited to build a stable, loving home for a little girl who deserved exactly that after what I understood to be a difficult, abandoned start. The small betrayal, though I didn't recognize it as one at the time, happened during our engagement when Grant mentioned, somewhat urgently, that we needed to move up our wedding date. The custody situation is complicated, he explained. Having a stable, married household documented sooner rather than later would really help protect Maya's security long term. I didn't question it deeply, assuming it related to formalizing legal protections against a mother he'd described as unpredictable and potentially dangerous to Maya's stability. We married 3 months later, faster than either of us had originally planned, and I threw myself completely into being a mother to Maya, attending school events, managing her routines, loving her as genuinely and completely as if she'd been my own daughter from birth. The bigger betrayal unfolded slowly, invisibly, over the following 3 years, though I only understood its true shape recently. Grant occasionally received phone calls he took in another room, brief and tense, always ending abruptly if I entered unexpectedly. When I asked about them, he'd explain vaguely that his lawyer was handling ongoing custody matters related to Renee, reassuring me there was nothing to worry about, that everything was being managed appropriately to protect Maya. I trusted him completely. I had no reason not to. Renee, in the story I'd been given, was someone who had chosen drugs and instability over her own daughter. Someone whose absence, while sad, felt like a reasonable consequence of choices she'd made herself. 3 weeks ago, everything I believed collapsed entirely. I received a phone call from a woman named Patricia, introducing herself as Renee's older sister, informing me, gently but directly, that Renee had passed away after a long battle with ovarian cancer and that the funeral would be held the following week. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, confused and disoriented, trying to reconcile the image of a substance-abusing, absent mother with news of a woman dying slowly from cancer. I didn't realize Renee had been sick, I said carefully. Patricia's voice grew hesitant on the other end of the line. You didn't know she'd been sick? For how long? I was told she struggled with substance abuse, I said slowly, and that she'd essentially disappeared from Maya's life years ago. The silence that followed lasted long enough that dread began settling heavily into my stomach before Patricia even responded. That's not accurate at all, Patricia said quietly. Renee has been fighting cancer for the past 4 years. She never abandoned Maya. Grant fought her for custody, using her diagnosis against her, claiming her illness made her an unfit, unstable parent, and the court ultimately sided with him partly because... She paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. Partly because he presented himself as remarried into a stable, 2-parent household almost immediately after their custody battle intensified. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, the entire foundation of my marriage suddenly cracking beneath me. Renee tried reaching out to Maya for years, Patricia continued gently, Cards, letters, phone calls. Grant blocked most of it, telling the court she was being erratic and inappropriate given her unstable condition. I think you should come to the funeral. I think there are things you deserve to understand fully. I hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour, memories rearranging themselves rapidly. Grant's urgency about our wedding timeline, the private phone calls, the vague explanations about custody matters I'd never fully questioned because I trusted him so completely. I didn't confront Grant immediately. I needed to understand the full truth before deciding how to handle something this devastating, this foundational to everything I believed about my marriage and my role in Maya's life. I did something I'm not entirely proud of, though I don't regret it either. I went through Grant's old filing cabinet while he was at work the following day, searching carefully through documents related to the original custody proceedings. Buried beneath tax records and insurance paperwork, I found a folder labeled simply Custody, Confidential, containing documents that painted a picture entirely different from the one I'd been given for 3 years. Medical records, subpoenaed during the original custody proceedings, showed Renee's cancer diagnosis dated back 4 years, roughly the same time Grant claimed she had disappeared due to substance abuse. Court filings showed Grant's attorney had aggressively framed her treatment-related absences and medication side effects as evidence of instability, despite medical documentation clearly explaining the actual circumstances. Most devastating of all, I found a series of emails between Grant and his attorney, dated just before our wedding, discussing timeline strategy explicitly. One email from Grant directly read, "Judge seemed favorable towards stability arguments last hearing. If we can show a finalized marriage before the next court date, it strengthens our position considerably. Renee's team will push back hard on the cancer narrative being used against her. We need the marriage locked in before that becomes the focus." I read that email at least a dozen times, the words rearranging the entire meaning of my wedding day, my proposal, the urgency I'd never questioned because I trusted the man asking me to move faster than either of us had originally planned. I hadn't married Grant purely out of love, or at least not purely out of love on his side of things. I had married him, at least in significant part, because doing so strengthened his custody case against a dying woman who had never actually abandoned her daughter at all. The funeral happened 6 days later. I attended, still processing everything, still uncertain exactly how to hold both my genuine love for Maya alongside the devastating truth about how deliberately I'd apparently been used to help erase her mother from her life. Grant attended reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable, keeping Maya close beside him throughout the service, occasionally glancing at me with an expression I now recognized as quiet anxiety rather than simple grief. During the reception afterward, held at Patricia's modest living room, surrounded by relatives grieving a woman I now understood had fought desperately, unsuccessfully, to remain part of her daughter's life, Patricia approached me quietly, holding a folded piece of paper. "I think you should see this," she said. Renee kept copies of everything, hoping someday Maya would understand the truth, even if the courts never fully saw it. She handed me the document, the same email thread I'd already found in Grant's filing cabinet. Except this version included several additional messages Grant had apparently deleted from his own copy, messages explicitly discussing the wedding timeline as a direct legal strategy against Renee's custody claims. "He needed a wife who looked stable on paper," Patricia said quietly. "That's all you ever were to him. I'm sorry someone finally has to tell you." I stood there, holding proof of exactly what I'd already begun to suspect, feeling the room tilt slightly around me. Grant, noticing the exchange from across the room, walked over quickly, his expression shifting to alarm as he recognized the document in my hands. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice low, urgent. "Renee kept copies," I said. "Of everything, apparently, including the parts you deleted from your own files." "Wait, what?" Grant's brother, standing nearby, said quietly, glancing between us with visible confusion. Grant's composure cracked slightly. "It's not what it looks like," he said. "The marriage was real. My feelings for you were real. I just..." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence in front of the small, stunned gathering now paying attention to our conversation. "You just needed a stable household documented before your next custody hearing," I said, my voice steady despite everything shaking beneath it. You told your attorney the wedding needed to happen quickly, specifically because of timing related to Renee's case. Maya, standing nearby holding her aunt's hand, looked between her father and me with the confused, uncertain expression of a child sensing something important happening that she couldn't fully understand. Patricia stepped forward gently. Renee spent her final 4 years fighting for the right to remain part of Maya's life while battling cancer, she said, addressing the small gathering directly now. She wrote letters every month that Maya never received. She fought a custody battle that was decided, in significant part, by a marriage strategically timed to strengthen the opposing case. The family reactions unfolded slowly around the small living room, several relatives who had gathered to grieve Renee now looking at Grant with a mixture of shock and quiet condemnation, understanding, for the first time, the fuller shape of what had actually happened during those final custody proceedings. Grant's mother, sitting quietly near the window throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her voice heavy with disappointment. "Grant, is this true? Did you really use your wedding as legal strategy against a dying woman?" Grant said nothing, his silence answering the question completely. I didn't yell. I didn't make a larger scene at what was, after all, someone else's mother's funeral reception, someone whose memory deserved better than becoming background noise to my own devastating discovery. I simply set the document down carefully on the table. "I need time," I said quietly, to Grant, to myself, to the entire complicated reality now settling over everything I'd believed about my marriage. I need time to understand what parts of the last 4 years were real. The emotional resolution that followed wasn't immediate or clean. I spent the following weeks in a complicated, painful reckoning, separating my genuine, unwavering love for Maya from the calculated strategy that had apparently shaped, at least partially, my own marriage. Grant and I began the difficult, ongoing process of untangling our relationship, complicated enormously by my continued fierce love for a little girl who had done nothing wrong in any of this, who deserved more than anyone honesty about her mother's actual story. I made sure, in the months that followed, that Maya learned the truth about Renee gently, carefully, at an age-appropriate pace, working with a family therapist to help her understand that her mother had never abandoned her, had fought desperately to remain part of her life despite an illness and a legal battle stacked against her from the beginning. I didn't feel triumphant, sitting with Maya months later, showing her photographs Patricia had shared, letters Renee had written that had never reached her, finally giving this little girl the truth about a mother who had loved her fiercely until her very last months. I felt something far heavier and more complicated. Grief for Renee, grief for the marriage I'd believed was built purely on love, and a fierce protective determination to make sure Maya never grew up believing her mother hadn't fought for her. The final lesson settled over me slowly, in the months following that devastating funeral reception, rebuilding a life that looked entirely different from the one I'd believed I was living for 3 years. Grant had spent years assuming that a carefully constructed narrative, reinforced consistently and confidently, would simply remain uncontested indefinitely. That Renee's illness and eventual passing would ensure the truth stayed buried permanently beneath the story he'd built. He mistook my trust, my genuine love for both him and Maya, for something that would never require verification, never demand the kind of scrutiny that might eventually expose exactly how calculated his timing had actually been. He never imagined that Renee, even while dying, even while losing custody unfairly, would carefully preserve every piece of evidence necessary for the truth to eventually reach her daughter, delivered not by anger or revenge, but by her own sister, standing quietly in a living room during a funeral reception, finally giving a grieving mother's fight the acknowledgement it always deserved. I never raised my voice at that funeral reception. I didn't need to. One preserved email thread, one grieving sister's quiet honesty, and one dying mother's careful documentation did what 3 years of a carefully constructed marriage narrative never could. Reveal the truth completely, undeniably, in the exact room where that truth finally belonged. Karma doesn't announce itself with shouting. It doesn't arrive the moment betrayal happens. Sometimes it waits patiently for years, preserved carefully by someone fighting her own final battle, until the exact moment her daughter finally deserves to know how hard her mother actually fought to stay. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button right now. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my situation? If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, emotional drama, shocking revenge, and the justice that always finds its way back, subscribe to Story Retribution and turn on the bell so you never miss the next story. Tomorrow's story might be even more unbelievable. See you then.